Before we begin, I want to thank you for joining me here today. If you find meaning in stories about family sacrifice and redemption, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. It helps us bring more of these heartfelt journeys to you, and I'd be grateful to have you along. Now, the story for today is titled The Envelope on the Altar. I never thought my wife's funeral would turn into a battlefield. Funerals are supposed to be sacred. They're supposed to be the one place where silence means respect and where grief binds us together, even if only for an hour. But on that day, standing in front of my wife's casket, I learned that grief can also rip families apart. I was 59 years old, silver hair combed neatly, my dark suit jacket slightly worn but pressed for the occasion. My hands, those rough workers' hands that had built this house and paid for every brick of it, were folded over the prayer book I held against my chest. My wife Jessica lay in her coffin, her face softened by makeup, her features strangely peaceful after months of pain. The church smelled of lilies, sweet and heavy in the air. Sunlight cut through the stained glass and painted patches of blue and red across the wooden pews. Friends and neighbors had gathered, bowing their heads, whispering prayers. The quiet was broken only by the creak of a pew or the sniffle of someone trying to hold back tears. And then in the middle of that holy silence, my eldest son leaned toward me. His voice was low, but sharp enough to cut bone. "Daddy," said, his eyes darting toward the altar, "give me the house deed." "Mom's gone, why keep it?" The words hit me harder than the sound of the church bell outside. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My heart pounded against my ribs and my knees wobbled as though the ground itself had shifted. Around us, I heard a few gasps from relatives close enough to catch his whisper. Their heads turned. Their faces tightened with the kind of disbelief you don't forget. There at the altar with my wife's coffin not 3 feet away, my son, my own flesh and blood, reduced my life, my marriage, my sacrifices to a piece of paper. I looked at him. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, the kind I knew he hadn't paid for. His hair was slicked back, and on his wrist a gold watch gleamed under the stained glass light. His mother had given him everything: her patience, her gentle words. Her secret envelopes of money slipped into his hand when he swore he needed it just this once. And now she was gone, and he was circling like a hawk, ready to strip the last feathers from the nest. I wanted to believe grief had twisted his tongue. I wanted to think pain had made him say something foolish, something he didn't mean. But when he looked back at me, there was no grief in his eyes. Only calculation. The sound of the organist shifting in his seat echoed through the church. I tightened my grip on the prayer book, the pages crinkling under my thumb. My mouth went dry. I tried to swallow, but the words that burned inside me refused to form. I remembered when that same boy had been 6 years old, tugging on my sleeve in this very church. Back then he whispered things like, "Dad, can I have candy after service?" His voice had been small, full of hope, not hunger. Now at 33, the same lips that once begged for candy asked for the house his mother and I had built with 40 years of sweat. Mourners shifted in their seats. Some glanced down to avoid the ugliness they had overheard. Others stared openly, their sympathy flicking from my face to my son's. The air felt heavier. The sweet smell of lilies turned bitter in my throat. I leaned closer, whispering back, "This is not the time." He smirked. "It's exactly the time, Dad. She's gone. Why pretend any more?" My body went cold. I looked at the coffin, at the woman who had held my hand through every storm, who had sacrificed her health so our children could live better than we had. And now, in the shadow of her silence, my son wanted to carve his inheritance before the ground had even received her. "Please," I managed, my voice trembling, "show some respect." But respect was not in him that day. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his jaw set like a man who had already won. The pastor stepped forward to begin the service, but I could barely hear him. My ears rang with my son's demand. "Give me the deed. Give me the house." The coffin gleamed under the altar lights. I thought of the envelope tucked inside my jacket pocket, the one Jessica had left me before she died. She had pressed it into my palm with her frail fingers, her voice barely more than a whisper, "When the time comes, Max, they'll know." And as I stood there with the congregation waiting, my son glaring and my wife lying silently beside us, I realized what she had meant. That envelope was more than paper. It was her final word, her last defense for the family we had built. The story that began with her death was about to take a turn none of them expected. I held my breath as the pastor's voice rose and fell, words of comfort drifting over the crowd like smoke I couldn't quite catch. My son's whisper still echoed in my ears, bitter and sharp. I clutched the prayer book tighter, my knuckles white, and let my eyes fall to the coffin one last time before closing them. And then, like an old reel of film playing in my head, I was carried backward in time. I saw myself at 25. My hair was still dark, then my back straight as a fence post. I worked 12-hour shifts at the mill, sweat stinging my eyes, the smell of iron and oil buried deep in my clothes. We had nothing, not even a car of our own. Jessica and I shared a single-bedroom apartment where the walls shook when the neighbors argued. But even in those lean years, we had dreams. One of those dreams had been for our boy. He was 5, maybe 6, when he first asked for a bicycle. His eyes lit up every time he saw the other kids racing down Maple Street, their laughter ringing through the summer air like bells. He stood at the window, fingers pressed against the glass, watching them ride circles around each other while he held a stick for a pretend horse. "Someday, Dad," he asked me, his little voice full of hope. "Someday I can have one too." I remember the lump that rose in my throat that night. We barely had money for rent. Jessica stretched grocery bills with coupons and whispered prayers. But I looked into his wide eyes and I couldn't tell him no. So I worked. I picked up double shifts at the mill. I carried extra crates at the warehouse down by the docks on weekends. My hands cracked, my back screamed, but I told myself it was just for a little while. Just until I had enough. The weeks blurred together. I remember coming home past midnight boots, leaving dark prints on the kitchen floor. Jessica would still be awake, waiting at the table, a cup of tea going cold in her hands. She'd smile tired but proud and place her palm on mine. "He'll never forget this," she whispered once. Neither will I. When the day finally came, I walked into Johnson's Hardware with a wad of bills folded tight in my pocket. I bought a bright red Schwinn with shiny chrome handlebars. It wasn't new, just a good used one, but to me it looked like a prize worth more than gold. I wheeled it into our apartment that evening, and our boy's eyes grew wide as the moon. He squealed, jumped up and down, then ran and hugged my leg so hard I thought he might topple me. Jessica laughed, clapping her hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. That moment, that joy burned itself into my memory. His laughter filled the tiny apartment like music. For a while, every bruise on my hands, every ache in my bones felt worth it. But now, standing in the church, decades later, his whisper ringing in my ears, I wondered. Did he remember that bike? Did he remember how his father bled and bent for his happiness? Or did those memories vanish the moment he learned money was easier to demand than to earn? The pastor's voice called us to rise for the hymn. My knees ached as I stood, the years pressing down on my joints. Around me, voices rose and sang Amazing Grace, tender and trembling. I sang too, though my throat was tight. The words blurred heavy with the weight of memory. I glanced sideways. My son stood stiffly, lips barely moving, eyes fixed, not on his mother's coffin, but on the floor, as if he were already calculating his next step. The gold of his watch caught the light again, and for the first time in my life I felt the distance between us stretch like a canyon. He didn't see the bike. He didn't see the cracked hands, the sleepless nights, the prayers whispered over cold tea. All he saw was a deed, a house, a number in a ledger. And as I sang the hymn for my wife, I realized this story was only beginning. The sacrifices of the past were shadows he had long forgotten, but for me they were alive, etched into every scar, every wrinkle, every memory. And if he wouldn't remember them, then I would make sure the world did. The hymn ended, and the church sank back into silence. I lowered myself into the pew, my knees creaking as if they carried not just my body, but the weight of 4 decades. My son stared straight ahead, his jaw locked. His whisper, "Dad, give me the house deed," still gnawed at me like rust on iron. I closed my eyes, and another memory came uninvited. It was years after the red bicycle, maybe when he was 12 or 13. The boy I once lifted onto my shoulders had grown taller, his voice cracking like a record skipping between child and man. His needs had grown too, not the innocent longing for a bike, but something sharper, heavier. I remember walking through the mall with him one Saturday. Jessica was home, folding laundry, humming like she always did. My son trailed behind me, his eyes darting to a storefront. Sneakers. Not just sneakers, designer ones with the kind of price tag that made my chest tighten before I even looked. Dad, he said, his tone already edged with entitlement. I need those. I chuckled at first, thinking it was a joke. Need, son, your shoes are just fine. He didn't laugh. He stepped closer, arms folded. Everyone at school has them. If I don't, they'll think we're poor. The word poor hit me harder than I expected. I had worked myself raw to make sure he never went hungry, never wore torn clothes, never felt the shame I had known as a boy with holes in his socks. Those shoes cost more than I make in 2 days, I said, trying to sound calm. So you can work more shifts. You always do. His words were careless, tossed out like scraps, but they sliced into me. I looked at him, the same boy whose laughter once filled our apartment when I rolled in that used bicycle. Now his eyes carried no gratitude, only expectation. That night, Jessica noticed my silence. She sat beside me on the couch, her dish towel still damp in her hands. What's wrong? I told her about the shoes. She sighed, pressing her lips together. He's just a kid, Max. Peer pressure is strong at that age. Maybe we can figure it out. And so we did. I took an extra weekend shift. Jessica clipped more coupons. A week later, we walked into that mall again, and I handed over cash for shoes that cost more than my entire first month's rent back when I was his age. His face lit up as he laced them on, showing them off in the mirror. He hugged me quick, distracted, already planning how to show his friends. I wanted to believe it was worth it, that his joy meant more than the ache in my back, the fatigue in my bones. But something changed that day. The bicycle had been a gift of love. The sneakers felt like a transaction. He asked, I delivered. And once a transaction begins, it rarely stops. I didn't know it then, but that was the first demand in a long line. The first time he learned that my sacrifices could be stretched, bent, even exploited. Back in the church pew, I opened my eyes and looked at him now, 33 years old, gold watch, glinting lips, pressed in a smirk. The boy who once begged for shoes had become the man who demanded a house deed at his mother's funeral. The pattern had begun long ago, and I had let it grow. The organ hummed again, soft and low, pulling me back into the present. My wife's coffin remained still at the altar, her hands folded, her lips forever silent. She had warned me in her gentle way that giving too much without boundaries could turn love into poison. And as I sat there, staring at my son, I knew the poison had spread. The church bells tolled softly as the service moved on, but I hardly heard them. My mind drifted again, carrying me back to another moment in his life, another time when love had been twisted into obligation. It was the spring of his wedding. He was 24, then restless and impatient with more swagger than sense. He and his fiancée wanted a grand celebration, something fit for magazine pages, not modest paychecks. Jessica and I had imagined a simple church gathering, maybe a dinner with family laughter echoing through a rented hall. But that wasn't enough for him. Dad, he said, the same tone he had used for the sneakers years before, only heavier now. We can't do a small wedding. Everyone's expecting something big. Don't you want me to start married life with pride? I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the evening sun spilling gold across the linoleum. My hands were stained from a day's work, the smell of machine oil still clinging to my shirt. Jessica set down a pot of stew, her eyes shifting between me and our son. Your father's done enough already, she said softly, but he waved her words away like smoke. You've worked your whole life, Dad. What's the point, if not to give your family the best? Always the best, never just enough. I didn't have the savings for a ballroom reception, not with the mortgage still heavy on my shoulders and Jessica's medical bills piling up. But pride is a dangerous thing in a father's chest. I told myself it was his one wedding day, that I could find a way. So I sold my tools. The set I'd built up over decades, wrenches worn smooth by my hands, drills that had bored through years of labor, the toolbox that had been my companion through every repair and side job. I loaded them into the back of a neighbor's truck, watching pieces of my life rattle away for half their worth. With the cash, I paid for the reception hall, the flowers, the band that played late into the night. I remember the laughter that filled the room, the clinking of glasses, the flash of cameras capturing smiles. My son and his new bride danced under strings of white lights, their faces glowing. I stood at the back, tired but content, holding Jessica's hand. She leaned into me, whispering, "You've given him everything, Max." I thought it was praise. Maybe it was a warning, because when the bills came due, there was no thank you, no repayment, only another request, another expectation. The tools were gone, my hands idle in evenings when I might have taken extra work to ease the load. I told myself it was worth it. After all, a father's duty is to give. But sitting now in this church, the coffin before me, my son at my side with his cold whisper of deeds and property, I felt the old wound reopen. That wedding had not been a celebration of love, it had been a transaction, just like the sneakers before it. He had learned that my sacrifices were endless, that my love was a bank with no closing hours. Jessica's coffin lay silent, her absence a weight pressing down on me. She had warned me in her final weeks, "Max, don't let him strip you of everything. You've given enough." I hadn't listened then, but as my son shifted in his seat, impatient even in his grief, I realized the truth of her words. I had traded my tools, my strength, my years for a gratitude that never came. The pastor's voice broke through my thoughts, calling for a reading. A cousin stepped to the lectern, his voice trembling over scripture. I bowed my head, but my eyes stayed open, locked on the gleam of my son's watch. Once I would have given him anything, but as the words of scripture washed over me, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," I knew my treasure was not in deeds or gold. It lay in the sacrifices etched deep into my skin, sacrifices he had long forgotten. And I began to wonder how many more would I allow. The scripture reading faded into the hush of the church, but my thoughts drifted far from the pulpit. One memory bled into another, as if grief had loosened the vault I'd tried so hard to keep sealed. It was 3 years after the wedding. Jessica had just come home from the hospital, her first real scare, the one that made me realize how fragile time had become. She was pale, moving slowly, but she insisted on cooking dinner anyway, humming at the stove. I had just settled into my chair when the phone rang. It was him. His voice was breathless, too quick, almost panicked. "Dad, I need your help. Just this once. It's serious." My stomach dropped. I'd heard that tone before, back when he was a boy caught sneaking candy from the store. Only this wasn't candy. His words tumbled out, rushed, ashamed, but desperate. He'd been gambling. Cards at first, then dice, then online. "It got out of control," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I owe people money. Real money." How much, I asked, though I dreaded the answer. There was a pause. 10,000. The room spun. $10,000. More than I had in savings, more than I could earn in months. Jessica looked at me from across the table, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish towel. "We can't," she mouthed. But I couldn't listen. He was my son, my only son. The same boy who once clung to me when thunder rattled the windows. The same boy whose first bike ride had sent him wobbling into my arms. I scraped together what I could. I sold the last of my old workshop machines, emptied the account we had set aside for emergencies. Jessica pleaded with me not to, but I silenced her with a promise. "Just this once," I said. "It will set him straight." I drove to the dingy part of town where the paint peeled from storefronts and neon lights flickered half dead. He waited for me outside a pool hall, his face pale, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked less like a man and more like the frightened boy I remembered, cornered and ashamed. I pressed the envelope of cash into his hands. He hugged me briefly, awkwardly, and muttered, "Thanks, Dad. You saved me." Saved him. That was the word he used. And I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe the money was a rope pulling him out of quicksand, not a shovel digging him deeper. But weeks later, another call came. His voice was the same frantic, desperate. The number was higher. And though I didn't have the money somehow, I found a way. Each time Jessica's face grew paler. "Max," she said one night, her voice breaking, "you're not saving him. You're teaching him to sink." I didn't answer. I couldn't. And so it continued. My savings drained my back, bent under extra hours I shouldn't have been working at my age. Every time I told myself it was the last, that this was the time he'd learn. But he never did. The worst was when I found out about his mother's jewelry. Jessica's wedding necklace, the one she wore when she walked down the aisle to me. Gone. Pawned quietly to cover another debt. She wept for 2 nights, her hand pressed to the hollow at her throat, where the necklace used to rest. "Why would he do that?" she whispered into the darkness beside me. Why would our own son strip me of the only thing I had left from that day? I had no answer. Only silence. Back in the pew, now my hands trembled on the prayer book. My son sat beside me, 33 years old, whispering for deeds at his mother's funeral, as if it were a marketplace negotiation. The gambling had not just taken his money. It had taken his soul. And I realized with a clarity that shook me to my core that the debts he owed were not just measured in dollars. They were measured in the pieces of his parents. He had carved away one desperate demand at a time. The pastor's voice rose again, calling us to bow our heads in prayer. Around me, the congregation obeyed their murmurs, blending with the faint hum of the organ. I bowed my head too, but my thoughts slipped far from the church. They carried me to another night years earlier, a night when sacrifice felt like breathing, when I believed love alone could hold a family together. It was the summer my son was 19. Reckless, wild, and restless, he had a way of brushing off rules like dust from his shoulders. He'd been out late with friends, driving too fast, too careless. I still remember the phone call that tore me from bed at 2 a.m. "Mr. Harris," the voice on the line was sharp, urgent. "Your son's been in an accident. You need to come to county hospital right away." The world tilted. I threw on the first clothes. I found my hands shaking so badly I fumbled the car keys twice before I could turn the ignition. Jessica sat beside me, pale and silent, clutching her rosary so tight the beads dug into her palm. The drive was only 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity, every red light an enemy. When we rushed into the emergency room, the smell hit me first, disinfectant mixed with blood and stale coffee. The overhead lights were harsh, buzzing faintly, washing every face in sickly yellow. Nurses moved briskly, shoes squeaking on linoleum clipboards, snapping open and shut. I found him lying on a gurney, pale under the fluorescent lights, his left arm bandaged, and his forehead split where the glass had kissed him. Tubes ran from his arm machines, beeped softly beside him. He looked small, and so much smaller than the man he was trying so hard to be. "Dad," he whispered when he saw me. His lips were dry, his eyes darting like a frightened boy's. I took his hand by rough, calloused palm against his trembling fingers, and I told him it was going to be all right. That's what fathers do. They say it will be all right even when their chest feels like it's caving in. The doctor came out, clipboard in hand, his voice steady but not unkind. "He'll be fine. Stitches observation, but he'll recover. The issue is the bill. He doesn't have insurance coverage yet." The words landed like stones. I already knew what they meant. My son had been between jobs, drifting, and I'd put off adding him to my plan because money was tight. The doctor gave me the number and my knees almost buckled. Thousands of dollars for a single night. I didn't hesitate. I signed every form they shoved at me, handed over my insurance card, and promised to pay what wasn't covered. The paperwork felt endless. My signature scrawled again and again like blood across the page. By dawn, when they finally wheeled him into a room, Jessica and I sat by his side, exhaustion pulling at our bones. I watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling, his face softened by the fog of medication. I thought about the nights I had carried him from his bed to ours when he was sick with fever, the way he clung to me when thunder rolled. And I thought about how once again I was carrying him, this time not in my arms, but on my back, in the form of debt and responsibility he barely noticed. He healed, of course. Young men always do. Within weeks, he was out with friends again, the scars on his forehead hidden under a new haircut. But the bill lingered. I picked up overtime, postponed a long-awaited vacation with Jessica, delayed repairs on the house. I never mentioned it to him. Not once. Because I told myself love was silent. Love didn't ask for repayment. Love simply gave. But sitting in the pew now with Jessica gone and my son whispering for the deed to our home, I wondered if silence had been my greatest mistake. Maybe love needs boundaries as much as it needs sacrifice. Maybe silence had only taught him that my giving was endless, bottomless, automatic. The organ swelled again, pulling me back to the present. I lifted my head, eyes stinging. Across the aisle, relatives dabbed at their faces with tissues. They thought my tears were for Jessica. And they were. But they were also for the man sitting beside me, my son alive because of me, provided for because of me, who now looked at me not with gratitude but hunger. The organ's last notes lingered in the church air like smoke fading into silence. I kept my eyes lowered, not on the coffin, not on the pastor, but on my hands resting in my lap. These hands had lifted beams, carried bricks, patched leaks, held steering wheels through midnight drives to hospitals. Hands that had built a life piece by piece for a family that now sat fractured beside me. And as I stared at them, another memory clawed its way to the surface. One that carried the bitter smell of credit card bills and the faint perfume of a daughter-in-law who had never known restraint. It was a winter evening. Snow pressed against the windows and thick white sheets muffling the world outside. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of envelopes in front of her. I came in from the cold, stomping the slush from my boots when I saw the look on her face. "Max," she whispered, sliding one of the statements across the table. "Look at this." I did, and my stomach twisted. Thousands of dollars charged in a single-month boutiques, downtown fine dining jewelry stores. My son's name on the account, but I knew whose hands had swiped the card. His wife's. She had a taste for things that sparkled, for purses that cost more than my first car, for shoes that could pay half a month's mortgage. And my son, God help him, never said no. When I asked him about it later, his voice was defensive, sharp. "Dad, that's how life is now. People expect us to look a certain way. We can't show up looking poor." That word again. Poor. As if the life I had built, the roof I had held steady, the food I had put on the table, was something to be ashamed of. Jessica tried to reason with him. "You don't need these things to prove your worth," she told him gently. "Your father and I lived decades without them. Love, honesty, hard work, that's enough." But he only laughed. Laughed. "Mom, times have changed. You don't get it." Times had changed, yes. But what hadn't changed was the weight on my shoulders. The bills piled up, and once again it was me who paid. Me who moved money from the retirement account we had carefully built, telling myself it was temporary, that this storm too would pass. I remember one night in particular. I was eating instant noodles at the kitchen counter, the steam fogging my glasses, while in the driveway, my son's wife pulled in with a brand new handbag draped over her arm. She didn't even glance at me as she walked past, her heels clicking on the tiles like gunshots. Jessica sat across from me, her hands folded tightly, her lips pressed together. She didn't say it aloud, but her eyes asked the question, "How much longer, Max? How much more will you give?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Back in the church, I lifted my gaze to my son, now 33, his wife beside him, dressed in black silk diamonds, glinting at her ears, even in mourning. She dabbed delicately at her eyes with a tissue, but I saw no tears, only calculation. The scent of lilies filled my nose, but it was overpowered by the memory of her perfume, expensive and sharp, lingering in my kitchen, long after she'd gone. I thought of the envelopes Jessica had laid before me, the numbers circled in red, her quiet plea for me to finally draw the line. But I never had. I told myself I was protecting my son, that appearances mattered to him, that love required sacrifice. But looking at him now, whispering about deeds at his mother's funeral, I realized what I had truly protected: his entitlement. And in doing so, I had sacrificed something far greater: respect. His respect for me. His respect for his mother. Even respect for himself. The pastor's voice carried across the sanctuary, reading scripture about honor, about children rising up and blessing their parents. My chest tightened. Those words felt like salt in an open wound, because honor was nowhere to be found in the eyes of the man who sat beside me. The pastor's words blurred into a hum, and I let them fade. My eyes stayed fixed on the coffin at the altar, but my mind wandered again backward through years that felt both close and impossibly far. I thought of another time I had bent myself in half to give him what he wanted. A time when the request didn't come from his wife's lips, or from the hunger of gambling debt, but from the restless eagerness of youth. It was the summer before college. He was 18, tall, proud, his eyes shining with the belief that the world owed him something. We had just finished dinner, and Jessica was clearing plates from the table when he leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out like a man who already owned the world. "Dad," he said casually, as though it were the simplest thing, "I need a car." I laughed, at first thought he was joking. "A car, son, you've got 2 good legs. They'll get you to class just fine." But his face stayed serious. "Everyone else will have one. How am I supposed to get around campus without a car? I'll look like a loser?" Loser. Another word that cut deeper than he knew. I remembered walking 5 miles to work in the freezing dawn boots, worn through at the sole, never once thinking I was less than anyone else. Work had been my dignity. Effort had been my pride. "You'll manage," I said quietly. But Jessica gave me that look, the look of a mother who couldn't stand to see her son feel small. Later that night, after he'd gone upstairs, she touched my arm. "Maybe we should help him, Max. Just a used car, something safe. It'll give him independence." I wanted to protest. The numbers in our checkbook already screamed too loudly. But I saw the hope in her eyes, and I remembered my boy's face when he'd first ridden that red Schwinn bicycle. I told myself a car was just the next chapter in that same story. So I sold mine. It wasn't new, just an old Chevy pickup, paint-chipped engine coughing when the weather turned cold. But it had been mine. I had hauled lumber in that truck, driven Jessica to the hospital in it when she went into labor, carried my children home from school plays in the back seat. It was a piece of me. I traded it in for a down payment on a used sedan, something modest but reliable. The salesman counted my crumpled bills with disinterest, but to me, every dollar was another callus, another night of overtime. When we handed him the keys, his face lit up like it was Christmas morning. He hugged Jessica, slapped me on the back, and within hours he was gone off to show his friends, to drive circles around town like a king. Jessica smiled through her tears. "You did the right thing, Max. He'll remember this." But I wonder now if he ever did, because the years that followed weren't filled with gratitude. The car became another expectation, another link in the chain of what he believed he deserved. When the tires wore thin, it was me who paid for new ones. When the transmission failed, it was me hunched under the hood, grease grinding into my skin. Back in the pew now, I looked at him, 33 polished shoes, silk tie, gold watch, glinting under the church lights. I thought about the Chevy I had sold the nights Jessica and I had walked home from the grocery store because we no longer had 2 cars. All of it so he could drive off into a future he never learned to build for himself. The lilies at the altar filled the air with their heavy sweetness. I swallowed hard, the scent almost suffocating. My wife's coffin gleamed in the light, her silence louder than any sermon. And I knew that every sacrifice we had made for him, every mile I had walked so he could ride, had led us here to this moment, to his whisper in my ear, asking for the deed to my house. The boy who once begged for a bicycle had grown into a man who thought nothing of taking everything. The lily's perfume clung to my throat, thick and heavy, as though the church itself wanted to choke me with memory. My son shifted beside me, his polished shoe tapping against the wooden floor, restless even in grief. I closed my eyes for a moment, and another night surfaced, the night he swore with tears in his eyes that it would be the last time. It was autumn, the air crisp with the smell of burning leaves. Jessica and I had just settled in the living room, the hum of the old heater filling the silence, when the phone rang. His voice was frantic, the same tone I had heard too many times before. "Dad, I swear this is the last time. Just one more loan. After this, I'll change. I'll get clean. I promise." Promises. By then, I'd heard 1,000 of them. Each one wrapped in desperation, each one dressed up as the final request. But I listened anyway. That's what fathers do. When he showed up at the house, his eyes were red. His hair unkempt, his hands twitching as he tried to hold his coffee. Jessica set a mug in front of him, her own hands trembling. She'd grown wary of the cycle of watching me shoulder debts we had no business carrying. "Son," I said, leaning forward, "you can't keep doing this. You can't live like this." "I know," he said quickly, too quickly. "I know, Dad. That's why this is it. This is the last time. I'll get help. I'll change. Please, just this once more." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She looked at me silently, begging me not to cave. But I saw him, my boy, broken, desperate, clinging to hope like a drowning man. I reached for my checkbook. Her sob caught in her throat. "Max," she whispered, "please don't." But I did. I wrote the number, tore out the check, pressed it into his shaking hand. He hugged me, his voice cracking. "Thank you, Dad. You'll see. This is the last time. I promise." We watched him drive away, taillights vanishing into the night. Jessica turned to me, her face pale. "You're not saving him," she said softly. "You're burying us." I didn't answer. I wanted to believe his words. I wanted to believe in his promise. But weeks later, another call came. Different excuse, same desperation. And when I confronted him, his eyes hardened. "Why are you surprised you've always helped me before?" The promise was broken as easily as a twig underfoot. And with it, something in me cracked too. Not enough to stop giving, but enough to leave a splinter lodged deep, festering in silence. Back in the church, I opened my eyes. My son sat stiffly, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the altar as though daring the coffin to speak. I thought about all those nights, all those promises broken one after another until the word itself meant nothing. I remembered Jessica's hand on mine in the dark, her whisper pressing against my ear. "You can't keep doing this, Max. You'll lose everything." And now here I was, her coffin before me, my son beside me, asking for the deed to my house as though 40 years of sacrifice had been nothing but down payments on his greed. The hymn ended. The pastor raised his hands for prayer. I bowed my head, but inside me something shifted. For the first time in decades, I didn't hear his voice as my son. I heard it as a creditor, a collector, a man who had mistaken love for an endless account. And I knew then that his promises would never change. Because promises mean nothing to a man who has never learned the weight of sacrifice. The pastor's prayer drifted through the air, gentle and practiced, but it barely reached me. My head bowed, yet my thoughts were not on the scripture. They were back in my own living room, in a memory that still stung like a fresh wound. It had been just last year, not decades ago. The house was quiet, too quiet, after another argument with my son. Jessica had gone to bed early, weary from his accusations, his endless demands. I stayed behind, slumped into the armchair, the clock ticking too loudly in the silence. That's when I saw it. The family photo on the mantel, our photo, the one taken years ago at the county fair, was turned face down. I blinked, thinking it had fallen. But no, the frame hadn't slipped. It had been placed that way deliberately, as though someone wanted to erase us. I walked to the mantel and lifted it. My younger self looked back at me, hair, dark shoulders, broad Jessica by my side, smiling wide, her hand resting proudly on my arm. And there, sitting on my shoulders, was my son, no older than 5, his gap-toothed smile beaming like sunlight. I stood there, frame in hand, staring at the boy who used to think his father was the strongest man alive. That same boy had grown into a man who just an hour earlier had shouted at me across the kitchen. "You're selfish, Dad," he had snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "You sit on all that money while we drown. Do you enjoy watching us suffer?" That was the word he used. I looked around the room, his wife's handbag on the chair, designer shoes by the door, their new SUV gleaming in the driveway. Their suffering looked more comfortable than my entire retirement plan. Jessica had tried to calm him. "Son, your father worked 40 years to give you this life. You can't keep," but he cut her off. 40 years of hoarding, you mean? He doesn't care about us. He just cares about his precious house. His words still rang in my ears as I turned the photo back upright that night. I traced Jessica's smile behind the glass, touched the tiny fingers of the boy clinging to my shoulders. I whispered into the empty room, "When did you stop seeing me as your father? When did I become just a wallet?" But no answer came, only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ache in my chest. Back in the church pew, I shifted uncomfortably, my hand brushing against the prayer book on my lap. My son sat beside me, stiff and silent, his face carved into a mask. I thought about that photo turned face down, about the choice it symbolized. Somewhere along the way, he had flipped me over in his heart, turned me face down, erased the image of sacrifice and love, leaving only the frame of expectation. The lilies on the altar swayed gently as the draft from an open window touched them. Their scent filled my lungs, sweet and suffocating. I wanted to breathe freely, but the weight of that memory pressed against me. I remembered how Jessica had come down the stairs that night, her eyes tired but gentle. She stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her gaze fixed on the photo. "He doesn't mean it, Max," she whispered, but we both knew he did. Now, with her lying silent in the coffin, I felt the truth even more sharply. A photo turned down was not just a gesture. It was a declaration. My son had already decided who I was to him. Not a father, not a man, just a ledger waiting to be cleared. And in that moment I realized something else. The photo was not the only thing that had been turned face down. My sacrifices, my worth, my place in his life. All of them had been quietly flipped, dismissed, erased. As the pastor closed his prayer, the congregation murmured their amens. I whispered mine too, but it was not for Scripture. It was for a father I once had been, for a son I once had, and for a picture that would never hang straight again. The congregation settled again, the pews creaking under shifting weight. I wiped a hand across my face, though no tears had fallen. My throat was tight, my chest heavy. Jessica's coffin rested at the altar, quiet, unbothered by the turmoil storming inside me. And then I remembered the last time Pastor Miller had come to our home. It was a spring evening, the kind when the air smells of rain and fresh-cut grass. Jessica had set a plate of cookies on the table. She always believed a guest deserved something sweet. The pastor sat across from us, his collar stark white against his black shirt, his hands folded loosely. He had come not for a donation drive, not for ceremony, but simply to check on us. He'd heard whispers, the way small towns always carry news faster than the wind. "Max," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you've carried this family on your back for longer than anyone should. You've given more than most men ever could." I shifted in my chair, uneasy. Praise always made me uncomfortable. "It's just what a father does," I muttered. But he shook his head. "No, Max. What you've done quietly without boasting is more than duty. Do you remember the church roof years ago I did? The storm had torn shingles away and rain had leaked straight into the sanctuary. The congregation worried we'd lose the building. I had slipped an envelope into the donation box, enough to cover the repairs. No one knew, not even Jessica, until years later. You kept us standing, the pastor said. We all know it now. You gave when no one else could. I waved a hand, embarrassed. That was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It had been overtime shifts, weekends spent away from home, my own repairs delayed. My son never knew. He never noticed the ladder leaning against our own leaking roof, waiting while I fixed the churches first. Jessica reached for my hand that evening, her fingers warm. He's right, Max. You've always given to the church, to your family, to everyone who asked. The pastor leaned forward, then his eyes kind but searching. But who gives back to you, Max? I had no answer. That question haunted me now, sitting in the church as Scripture echoed around the rafters. My son whispered for deeds, but the man in the coffin-shaped silence at the altar had once seen me differently. Pastor Miller had recognized what my son never had, that sacrifice is not endless, that it carves a man down to bone if no one ever gives in return. The pastor was there that night when Jessica fell ill again. He prayed over her in the hospital room, his voice steady even as mine shook. He told me, your strength has held this family for decades. But strength needs rest too. And now with her gone, I felt the weight of those words more than ever. Back in the pew, I lifted my eyes to him, Pastor Miller himself, standing now at the lectern reading scripture for my wife. His voice carried the same calm authority as always, but this time it cut deeper. Honor thy father and mother, he read, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. I swallowed hard. My son shifted beside me, arms crossed, unmoved. The words struck me like a hammer. Not because they were new, but because they were old, older than any contract, older than any deed. Honor was not about money. It was about memory, sacrifice, love. And as the pastor's voice echoed in the rafters, I realized the truth. My son had forgotten every ounce of it. But the world hadn't. Others had seen. Others had remembered. And maybe, just maybe, they would help me remind him. Pastor Miller's voice still echoed faintly in my ears when the service ended. The mourners rose, their footsteps shuffling softly against the old church floorboards. Some moved toward me with gentle hands on my shoulder, murmuring condolences I barely heard. Others walked straight to the coffin heads, bowed, whispering prayers. That's when I felt someone at my side. It was Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor from across the street. She had lived there as long as we had her garden blooming every spring like a hymn of survival. Her hair was white now, her hands gnarled, but her eyes still carried the same warmth that had once watched over our children playing in the yard. She leaned close, her voice a whisper meant for me alone. Max, we've seen things. I blinked, turning to her. Seen what? Her lips pressed together, trembling. She glanced past me toward my son, who stood at the back of the sanctuary, his wife's arm looped through his. They were already speaking in low tones, their faces tight with impatience, as if the funeral were nothing but an interruption in their schedule. Don't think we haven't noticed, she said. The shouting, the late-night arguments, the way he comes to your door, and doesn't leave until hours later. I stiffened, shame creeping up my neck. I thought we had kept it behind closed doors, that the walls of our home held the secrets of our struggle. But the world had heard. She touched my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Max, I remember the nights I saw you heading to work long after the rest of us were asleep. I remember Jessica walking across the street to borrow flour because you had given away your grocery money again. You sacrificed for that boy, and everyone in this neighborhood knows it. Her words cut through me sharper than my son's whispers, because they weren't just memory, they were witness. Proof that my sacrifices had not been invisible even if my son refused to see them. I swallowed hard. Mrs. Henderson, I thought we'd hidden it. She shook her head gently. Max, people see more than you realize. We saw the good too. We saw the way you fixed our roof after the storm, the way you shoveled snow for old Mr. Grady down the block when his back went out. You've carried this whole street on your shoulders at one time or another. Her voice lowered, turning firm. Don't let him tell you you're selfish. Don't let him twist what you've given. You and Jessica, you were the most selfless people I've ever known. My throat burned. I wanted to thank her, but the words stuck. All I could do was nod my hand, clutching the back of the pew for support. She patted my arm, her eyes misting. I know it hurts, Max, but the truth has a way of standing taller than lies. Remember that. With that, she drifted back into the crowd, her black coat blending into the sea of mourners. I stayed frozen, her words circling in my head. Others had seen. Others knew. My son's version of the story, the one where I was a miser, selfish, hoarding money while he suffered, was not the only one that existed. There were witnesses to the real story. Witnesses to the truth. I glanced at him again. He was laughing now, laughing at something his wife whispered, as though the coffin before us were no more important than a coffee table. The lilies on the altar swayed again in the draught, their scent rising heavy and sweet. But for the first time since the service began, I felt a thin thread of strength weave through my chest. Because I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, when the time came, the voices of others would rise with mine. The crowd moved slowly from the church to the hall beside it, where coffee and sandwiches waited. The air buzzed with murmured condolences, chairs scraping against the floor, the faint clink of cups. I followed numbly Jessica's absence, a hollow space at my side. I was stirring a cup of weak coffee when I heard a voice behind me. "Mr. Harris." I turned and found myself looking into a familiar face, though older now lined with years. It was Mrs. Dalton, my son's old high school teacher. She was smaller than I remembered, her gray hair pinned back neatly, her hands folded around a paper plate of cookies. "I hope you don't mind me saying something," she began, her voice soft but steady. I shook my head. "Please." She looked at me with kind eyes. "I taught your boy junior year. Smart kid when he wanted to be. But what I remember most isn't his work. It was yours." "Mine?" I frowned, confused. She nodded. "He came to class one day with a brand new graphing calculator. All the other kids were buzzing about it, top of the line, the kind most parents couldn't afford. He bragged a little, as teenagers do. But later I overheard him tell a friend my dad worked an extra shift so I could get this. Said I needed the best if I was going to make it." I blinked. The memory came back like a knife, the late nights at the factory, the sting of grease in my eyes, the ache in my back as I added hours on top of exhaustion. "Also, my boy wouldn't sit in class with the cheap model, embarrassed or left behind." Mrs. Dalton's voice lowered, her eyes glistening. "He told me once that you'd do anything for him, that you were the kind of father who never let him go without. And I believed him, because every time I saw him in that classroom, I knew the sacrifice behind what he carried in his hands." My chest tightened. For a moment I could almost see that boy again, not the man whispering for deeds at a funeral, but the teenager who once knew his father's sweat had bought him tools for success. I rubbed a hand across my face. "Funny he doesn't talk that way anymore?" She gave me a sad smile. "Time does that. Entitlement grows where gratitude used to live. But don't you forget what you've given. We all saw it, even if he's chosen to forget." Her words struck deep, anchoring themselves in the same place Mrs. Henderson's had earlier. Another witness. Another voice reminding me that sacrifice doesn't vanish just because someone stops saying thank you. I managed a nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalton. That means more than you know." She touched my arm lightly. "You did right by him, Mr. Harris. No one can take that away." As she walked off, her words echoed in my head. You did right by him. But if I had done right, why did it all feel so wrong now? Why was I sitting at my wife's funeral being treated like a vault? Instead of a father across the room, my son leaned against a wall, scrolling on his phone, his wife's manicured hand resting possessively on his arm. Not once did he glance at the coffin through the open doorway. I gripped my coffee cup tighter, the thin styrofoam bending under my hand. He had once told a teacher I would do anything for him. And he was right. I had done everything. And maybe that was the problem. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, untouched. The chatter of mourners blurred around me, voices overlapping like static. I sat in the corner of the church hall staring into the styrofoam cup when another figure approached. "Mr. Harris," I looked up. It was Dr. Patel, our family doctor. He had cared for Jessica for years through her ailments, her quiet battles, her last decline. His face was solemn, his dark eyes carrying both sorrow and something else, something heavier. "I just wanted to say," he began, then paused. "Jessica always spoke so highly of you." My throat tightened. She was the one worth speaking highly of. But he shook his head firmly. "No, Max. You should know what she told me in those last months." I sat up, the styrofoam crinkling under my grip. "What did she say?" He glanced around the room, then pulled a chair beside me. His voice lowered, careful. "She said you were the reason she could face each treatment with dignity. That every time the bills came, every time the weight of it all seemed too much, you found a way. She told me my husband works himself thin, but he never lets me see the cracks." My eyes burned. I remembered those nights, long shifts, followed by long hospital visits. Sitting beside her bed in wrinkled work clothes, smiling when she looked at me, even though my body screamed for rest. "Doctor," Patel's words pressed on. She told me once I worry for him more than myself, because he gives until there's nothing left and still he tries to give more. I swallowed hard, staring at the floor. He leaned closer, his hand firm on my shoulder. Max, I see families every day. Some abandon each other when sickness drains them. Some hide from responsibility. But you, his voice steadied, you gave her everything you had. And she knew it. Don't ever doubt that. I wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in my chest. All I could do was nod my jaw tight, my vision blurred. He rose slowly. You've carried too much alone. I only hope he hesitated, his eyes flicking toward my son across the room. I only hope others realize what you've done before it's too late. My gaze followed his. My son was laughing at something his wife whispered, his phone glowing in his hand, as if this day were nothing more than an inconvenience. Doctor. Patel's voice softened. Jessica told me she feared he didn't see it, that he'd never see it, but she prayed you'd hold the line someday, that you wouldn't let him take more than you could give. The line. Those words stayed with me long after he moved away into the crowd. Hold the line. I thought about every sacrifice, tools sold, debts paid, hours worked, cars given, promises forgiven. I had never drawn the line. Not once. And now here I was, with my wife in the coffin, and my son demanding deeds. I set the cold coffee aside and rubbed my hands together, rough against rough, calloused against calloused. Dr. Patel's words rang inside me, weaving together with Mrs. Henderson's and Mrs. Dalton's. Witnesses. All of them had seen. All of them had remembered. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't selfish. I was a father who had given everything. And maybe finally it was time to hold the line. I sat in that hall, the voices of witnesses echoing in my chest. Mrs. Henderson's whisper, Mrs. Dalton's memory, Dr. Patel's quiet truth. They formed a chorus louder than my son's silence, louder than his wife's polished smile. I thought it was over, that no more voices would rise. But then, as I stepped outside for air, the cool breeze brushing against my face, another came. Mr. Harris. I turned and saw Daniel, Mrs. Henderson's boy. Except he wasn't a boy anymore. He was in his 30s now, taller than me, with lines on his face from years of working construction. But I still saw the child who had once kicked the ball across our shared lawn, who had eaten Jessica's cookies at our kitchen table. He shifted nervously, as if unsure whether to speak. Finally, he blurted, I don't know if this is the right time, but I just wanted to tell you something. I nodded. Go ahead. His eyes softened. When I was in high school, my folks didn't have much. Money was tight. I remember one winter our furnace broke. We couldn't afford to fix it. My mom was wrapping me in blankets just to get through the nights. I remembered that bitter cold, the way their windows frosted from the inside. And I remembered the hours I'd spent in my garage, sleeves rolled up, tools spread across the concrete. Daniel's voice caught. You showed up one night with your toolbox. You spent 3 hours fixing that furnace. Wouldn't take a dime. You just smiled and said, take care of your mom, kid. That's payment enough. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. Mr. Harris, I never forgot that. You gave when you didn't have to. You gave to all of us, not just your family. That's the kind of man you are. My throat closed. I remembered walking back across the snowy street that night, my breath clouding in the air, my hands numb, but my heart steady. I hadn't thought much of it. It was just what neighbors did. But here was a grown man decades later carrying that night like a lantern in his chest. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know. He hesitated, then added, I see how your son looks at you. I hear the things he says. But don't you let him convince you otherwise. We all know who you are. We all know what you've given. His words landed with the weight of truth. Because it wasn't just one memory, it was dozens. Fixing fences, patching roofs, lending tools, shoveling driveways. My sacrifices had stretched beyond my bloodline. Others had seen. Others remembered. I looked at Daniel, this man who once was a boy playing ball under my watch. and I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had believed my worth was measured only by my son's gratitude or lack of it. But here was proof that my life had spilled over into others, that my giving had left ripples long after I had forgotten the splash. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, marking the hour. Daniel clasped my shoulder once firmly, then walked back inside, leaving me under the fading light. I stood there staring at the horizon where the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. And I realized that all these voices, the neighbor, the teacher, the doctor, now the neighbor's grown child, had built a case stronger than any ledger. My son thought he had rewritten the story, cast me as the miser, the selfish old man hoarding money. But the truth was written in other people's lives. And when the time came, I would let that truth speak louder than his lies. For the first time since the coffin closed, I felt steady. Steady enough to face what was coming. The sun was sinking by the time I stepped back into the reception hall. The air inside felt thicker than before, heavy with perfumed coffee and the weight of conversations that didn't belong to a funeral. My son stood near the food table, his wife glued to his side, her hand wrapped around his arm like a chain. I hadn't even crossed the threshold before his eyes locked on me. Cold. Calculating. "Dad," he called out, his voice just loud enough to hush nearby chatter. "We need to talk." Every head turned. Forks clinked back onto plates. Even the pastor, standing near the doorway, paused. My chest tightened, but I walked toward him. "Not now," I murmured, keeping my voice low. But he didn't lower his. "Yes, now. Mom's gone. It's time to face reality." Gasps rippled through the room. His words hung in the air, shameless, unsoftened by grief. I tried to steady my breath. "This isn't the place." He leaned closer, but his voice still carried. "It's exactly the place. Everyone here knows you're sitting on the deed, the savings, everything. Why keep hoarding it when your own blood is struggling?" His wife's eyes glittered like polished stones. "He's right, Mr. Harris," she chimed in sweetly, though her tone was sharp enough to cut. "Family is supposed to share. Jessica would have wanted that." Her name on her lips was a desecration. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. Across the room, Mrs. Henderson whispered to another neighbor. "Mrs." Dalton's face tightened, her jaw set. Dr. Patel watched carefully, as if waiting for a line to be crossed. Daniel stood near the back, arms folded, his eyes fixed on me with quiet solidarity. "The witnesses." "All of them." I took a breath. My voice was steady when I answered. "You think you know what your mother wanted. You weren't there in those nights when she prayed I wouldn't break under the weight of your demands." His face darkened. "Don't twist this. You've had more than enough. You're selfish if you can't see we need it now." Selfish. That word again. The room fell silent. Even the children in the corner stopped fidgeting. All eyes were on us. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd. Then I looked back at him. "You want the truth, fine. Let's give it to them." I walked to the front of the hall, my shoes heavy on the wood floor, and took the microphone from its stand. My son blinked, startled. His wife whispered something urgently in his ear, but he didn't move. I looked out at the faces, neighbors, relatives, friends. People who had known Jessica and me for decades. People who had seen more than I realized. "My son," I began, my voice trembling only slightly, "has asked me for the deed to my house. Here today at his mother's funeral." Gasps again. Murmurs rose, shocked and disbelieving. My son shifted uneasily now, his wife tugging at his sleeve. I held the microphone tighter. "He thinks I've been selfish, that I've hoarded what I worked for while he suffered." My eyes moved deliberately toward Mrs. Henderson. "But neighbors know the truth. They saw me leave for work in the middle of the night, just to pay for the very bills he ran up." Then, to Mrs. Dalton, "His teachers knew the truth. They knew I worked overtime so he could walk into school with the best tools, never once feeling less than his classmates." Then, to Dr. Patel, "Even his mother's doctor knew the truth, that every time we faced a mountain, I carried her and him up it on my back." Finally, I met Daniel's eyes. And children who grew up alongside mine knew the truth, that I gave not just to my own, but to every family on our street whenever they needed me. The room was silent now, heavy waiting. My son's face flushed red, his mouth opening, then closing, no words coming out. I took a breath, steady as a hammer striking steel. So, let's be clear. My sacrifices are not invisible. They are written in the lives of the people standing here today. If you call that selfish, then you've forgotten what the word sacrifice means. The microphone crackled faintly, then fell quiet as I lowered it. The silence that followed was louder than applause. My son shifted again, but now the weight of every eye in the room pressed down on him. His wife's hand slipped from his arm. I felt something I hadn't in years: control. Not the control of money, not the control of silence, but the control of truth. And for the first time, I knew I would not bend again. The microphone still buzzed faintly as I set it back on the stand. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the release of holding so much inside for so long. The room was thick with silence, the kind that swallows every cough, every shuffle, every nervous breath. I turned my gaze toward the coffin. Jessica lay within, quiet, untouched by this storm, but I could almost hear her voice. Max, hold the line. And then I saw it. On the altar, just beneath the spray of lilies, rested a small, weathered envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with the neat care that only Jessica had. I had noticed it earlier in passing, but grief had clouded my mind. Now, under the weight of my son's demand, and the eyes of everyone gathered, the envelope seemed to glow. I stepped forward. The air shifted, whispers stirring as people leaned in. My son's voice cut across the room, sharp and panicked. Dad, leave it. I ignored him. My fingers reached for the envelope, rough skin brushing against its fragile paper. The handwriting on the front made my knees weak. Jessica's script, steady and graceful spelling, only one word: Max. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My son took a step closer, his wife gripping his arm to hold him back. But the fear in his eyes told me everything. He knew somehow, he knew this letter wasn't meant for him. With shaking hands, I turned to the crowd, holding up the envelope. Jessica left this, and I think it's time we all hear what she had to say. Gasps. Murmurs. My son hissed through his teeth. Don't you dare. But I had already begun to open it. The seal gave way with a soft tear, the paper unfolding in my hands like a fragile wing. Inside was not just a letter, but a folded document, crisp against the yellowed stationery. I read aloud, my voice steadier with each word. Max, if you are reading this, it means I've gone on before you. I've watched you carry this family on your shoulders, giving and giving until there was nothing left but bone. I've watched our son take without gratitude, without understanding. I've worried for the day he would try to strip even the roof over your head. The crowd stirred, heads turning toward my son, whose face had gone pale. I continued. So, I have made a choice. Enclosed is a document transferring the deed of our home, not to him, but to Emma. To our granddaughter. She is the future Max. She is the one who still sees love as love, not as currency. Let her inheritance be education, stability, and the knowledge that her grandparents fought for her, not for greed. My voice cracked as I read the final line. Hold the line, Max. Don't let him take what belongs to tomorrow. I lowered the letter. My hand shook as I unfolded the second sheet, the official document. The notary's seal gleamed under the church lights. It was real. Ironclad. The silence broke like glass. Gasps erupted, whispers crashing against each other. Eyes darted between me and my son, between the letter and the coffin. He lunged forward. This is a trick, he shouted, his voice cracking. She wouldn't do that to me. I'm her son. I raised the paper higher, letting the notary's stamp speak louder than his rage. She already did. His wife tugged at his arm, hissing for him to stop, but he shook her off, his face twisted with fury. You can't skip me over like this. That house is mine. The pastor stepped forward, then his calm voice cutting through the chaos. No, son. That house is theirs to give. And they've chosen. The crowd murmured in agreement. Mrs. Henderson nodded firmly. Mrs. Dalton whispered a prayer. Dr. Patel crossed his arms, his expression resolute. Daniel stared at my son with quiet disgust. The witnesses. They weren't just voices now, they were a wall. I folded the letter, gently sliding it back into the envelope. My voice was low, but it carried. You asked me for the deed. Here's your answer. It was never yours to begin with, and now it belongs to Emma. The room erupted not with chaos, but with applause. Quiet at first, then swelling a chorus of hands clapping in support and recognition and justice. My son froze, his eyes wide, his face red. He looked around, but no one was with him now. Not a single hand reached out. Not a single voice rose in his defense. I felt the weight lift from my chest just slightly. Jessica's words echoed in my mind, hold the line. And for the first time in years, I knew I finally had. The applause thundered in my ears, rattling through the hall like a storm breaking over dry land. I held Jessica's letter close to my chest, the notary's seal catching the light, the paper warm in my hand. For a moment I felt taller, steadier, as though Jessica herself stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder. But then the applause faded, and I heard it, the sound of my son's fury, bubbling up like a kettle ready to burst. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the clapping like a blade. "All of you stop applauding him." The room quieted, the echoes of hands dying away. Every eye turned back to him. His face was crimson, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. He stepped forward, jabbing a finger at me. "This is a lie," he roared. "A trick. You all think he's some kind of saint, but you don't know him like I do. You don't know what he's really like." Gasps fluttered around the room. His wife tugged at his arm, hissing, "Stop. You're making it worse." But he shook her off. I stayed where I was, silent, the letter still in my hand. "You want to talk about sacrifice?" he spat. He didn't sacrifice. He controlled every dollar, every decision. It was always his way. He used money to make me feel small, to remind me I'd never measure up. That's not love. That's cruelty, the hall buzzed, people whispering to each other. Some shook their heads. Others frowned. I could feel the weight of the crowd bending, undecided, waiting for me to break. My son's voice cracked with venom. He didn't give because he loved me. He gave because he wanted to own me, and now, he hides behind Mom's letter as if she'd really cut me out. You all know she loved me more than anything. You think she'd do this? He swept his arm toward the coffin, his voice rising to a shriek. This is fraud. This is betrayal. He's not a father. He's a tyrant. The room stilled, the air thick as wet wool. Even the children huddled close to their mothers, wide-eyed. I felt my pulse steady, slow, like the beating of a drum. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, heavy with years he could never erase. You call it cruelty? I said softly, but the microphone carried it clear. But tell me, who paid for your college car, who covered your gambling debts when men came looking for you, who sold his own tools so you could have a wedding beyond your means, who sat by your hospital bed signing papers that nearly broke us so you could walk out alive, his mouth open, but no words came. I took a step closer, my eyes locked on his. You call it control. I call it fatherhood. You call it ownership. I call it sacrifice. And maybe that's the difference between us. You've never learned that love isn't about taking. It's about giving until your hands are empty. Gasps rippled again, but this time they weren't for him. They were for the truth. Mrs. Henderson stood. I saw it, boy. I saw your father work nights while you shouted at him for more. Don't you dare call that cruelty. Mrs. Dalton's voice followed, trembling but firm. He gave you everything. And I know because your father once told me he'd rather go without than see you ashamed in my classroom. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his voice calm but strong. Your mother told me herself your father carried her, and you every day. Don't spit on that. And then Daniel's voice, deeper than before, resonant. I was the boy next door. Remember, I watched him fix our furnace in the dead of winter while you sat warm in your house. Don't stand here and call him selfish. The voices rose like a tide, each one layering over the next, until the room swelled with testimony. My son's face twisted, his anger cracking into desperation. You're all blind. He's fooled you. He's fooled you all. He lunged forward then, as if to grab the envelope from my hand. Gasps and shouts erupted, chairs scraping as people moved between us. The pastor stepped quickly, planting himself between us, his hand raised. That's enough, Pastor Miller's voice thundered sharper than I'd ever heard. This is a house of God and a day of mourning. You will not desecrate it further. My son froze his chest, heaving his eyes wild. For a moment I saw not a man but a child, angry, lost, terrified of losing what he thought was his. And then he turned, shoving past the crowd, his wife scrambling after him. The doors slammed behind them with a crash that shook the hall. Silence followed, broken only by the creak of the building, settling the rustle of paper in my hand. I stood there, breath steady, heart calm. Around me the faces of neighbors, friends, witnesses, all fixed on me, not with pity, but with respect. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just a father carrying a burden. I was a man who had spoken the truth and who had been heard. The echo of the slammed doors still rattled in the rafters. For a long moment no one moved. The scent of lilies hung heavy, the weight of Jessica's coffin pressed on us all, and I stood in the center of the hall with her envelope clutched against my chest. Then it began, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. Max, Mrs. Henderson's voice rose clear, breaking the silence. You did right. She wasn't whispering now. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Her wrinkled hands clasped together, and she nodded firmly. And then another voice, Mrs. Dalton's, trembling but strong. You've given more than any father I've known. No one here doubts it. The murmurs swelled. Heads nodded, shoulders straightened. Neighbors, friends, even relatives who had sat silent through the shouting now stepped forward with words I never expected to hear. Doctor, Patel cleared his throat, his calm voice carrying weight. Max, I've watched families fall apart under far less. You held yours together through decades of sacrifice. Don't let anyone twist that truth. I gripped the envelope tighter, my chest swelling. Daniel, the boy from across the street, now grown into a man, stepped to the front. You fixed our furnace when we had nothing. You bought us heat in the middle of winter. I was just a kid then, but I never forgot. My family never forgot. You showed me what a man should be. Applause broke out again, not the shocked kind from before, but steady, united. A rhythm that filled the hall and drowned out the lingering sting of my son's venom. The pastor raised his hands, waiting for quiet, then spoke in his steady baritone. Max, you have lived Scripture without needing to quote it. The book says, a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Today, Jessica's letter made that truth plain. You've honored her and you've honored God by leaving your legacy with Emma. The mention of my granddaughter's name tugged at my heart. I pictured her small hands, her curious eyes, her laughter in the backyard when she was still innocent of all this ugliness. The thought of her holding the deed one day, a house filled not with greed but with memory, brought a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I looked out at the crowd, their faces turned toward me. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with respect. For so long I had carried the weight of my silence, believing my sacrifices had vanished like smoke. But here they stood, witnesses who had seen, remembered, and now spoke. Jessica had been right. I wasn't alone. I raised the envelope slightly, my hand steady. You've all heard the truth today. My wife's last words, my life sacrifices, your own memories of what was given. I can't change my son's heart, but I can honor her wishes, and I can honor what's right. Applause swelled again, stronger this time, echoing off the walls like thunder. I stepped back, my knees weak, and sank into the nearest chair. Mrs. Henderson came and placed a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, she whispered. Her words cracked something open in me. For decades I had believed fatherhood meant silence, that my sacrifices were invisible threads, strong but unseen. Now for the first time I realized those threads had been woven into the fabric of an entire community. And that fabric held me up. I closed my eyes briefly, hearing Jessica's voice again, soft, insistent, hold the line. When I opened them, the crowd had begun to gather near the coffin. Neighbors placed hands gently on the wood, whispering their goodbyes. The pastor began a final prayer. Children shuffled close to their mothers, but every so often a glance would flick toward me. Nods of respect. Eyes that said, "We know. We saw. We remember." I sat taller in my chair, the envelope still in my lap. My son had stormed out, but he hadn't won. His lies had cracked and crumbled under the weight of truth, and the community had chosen where to stand. And for the first time in years, I felt not just like a father, but like a man who had reclaimed his place in the world. The storm had broken. The line had been drawn, and I would not step back from it again. The sun was sinking by the time I stepped outside. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of lilacs from the bushes that lined the church. I clutched Jessica's envelope against my chest as though it were a shield, the notary seal pressing into my palm like a brand. The parking lot was mostly empty now. Neighbors had offered handshakes, hugs, words of strength before filing into their cars. Some left casseroles on the back seat of mine, their way of showing love when words fell short. A few had promised to stop by in the coming days. For the first time in a long while, I believed them. But when I slid into the driver's seat, the silence fell heavy. No more applause, no more whispers, no more voices reminding me I wasn't alone. Just the hum of the engine and the long road stretching between the church and my empty house. The steering wheel felt cold under my rough hands. I pulled onto the main road, headlights flickering to life in the growing dusk. Every turn of the tires seemed to echo the weight in my chest. I replayed the scene in my mind, the gasp of the mourners, the fury in my son's eyes, the sound of the doors slamming shut. I had stood firm. I had spoken truth. But the ache lingered, not just from his words, but from the memory of the boy he used to be. There was a time years ago when he would ride in this very passenger seat, legs too short to reach the floor, sneakers kicking against the glove box. He'd pepper me with questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do dogs bark? When will I be old enough to drive back then? The idea that one day he'd stand at his mother's coffin demanding the house deed would have been unthinkable. I gripped the wheel tighter, the leather creaking beneath my fingers. When did he change? Or was it me who refused to see it? The road narrowed, trees casting long shadows across the pavement. My headlights carved tunnels through the dark. I passed the Henderson's place lights glowing warm inside, children's laughter spilling faintly through the open window. A picture of family life untouched by betrayal. I couldn't help but wonder if they knew how blessed they were. At a red light, I glanced at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Jessica's handwriting stared back at me, steady even in death. Max, it read as if she were still speaking to me. Hold the line, I whispered to the envelope. I'm trying, Jess. God knows I'm trying. The light turned green. I drove on. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed dark and quiet. Once Jessica would have been waiting at the door porch, light glowing, her silhouette framed against the window. Now it was just me and the hum of the engine. I sat there for a long moment, reluctant to step into the silence. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, 8:43 p.m. I cut the engine, the sudden stillness pressing in like a weight. Inside the house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. I set the envelope on the dining table, its presence filling the room more than any person could. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and the floor creaked beneath my steps. I moved through the house, slowly touching the back of a chair, the edge of the mantel, the photo frames lined neatly where Jessica had arranged them. Emma's school pictures smiled back at me, gap-toothed and bright-eyed. A reminder of what this fight was really for. I lowered myself into my armchair, joints aching. The silence was deafening. No Jessica humming in the kitchen. No son asking for just a little help. No laughter, no footsteps, no sound but the ticking clock on the wall. And yet, within that silence, something else stirred calm. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine. Not a bank branch for endless demands. Not a battlefield for shouted accusations. Just a home. I leaned back, closing my eyes, listening to the quiet. It wasn't peace, not yet. Too many battles remained, too many scars left raw. But it was a start. Tomorrow, I knew the storm would return. My son wouldn't let this end with a slammed door. He'd come back angrier, more desperate, perhaps even dangerous. But tonight, the silence was mine. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling where shadows flickered in the lamplight. Jessica's voice came back to me again, soft and steady. Hold the line, Max. I will, I whispered into the stillness. For Emma. For you. For me. And for the first time since the funeral began, I allowed myself to breathe. The next morning broke gray and heavy clouds smothering the sunrise. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, Jessica's envelope resting in front of me like a sentry. I hadn't moved it since last night. The notary seal still gleamed faintly under the lamplight, a symbol of her strength and mine. The house was quiet except for the slow tick of the wall clock and the faint groan of old pipes. I'd almost convinced myself I had a few hours of peace when I heard the low growl of an engine pulling into the driveway. I set the mug down, my jaw tightening. Through the lace curtains, I saw the car, my son's black sedan, parked crooked across the gravel. The door slammed. Then another. Heavy footsteps crunched toward the porch. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the weary certainty that the storm had come back just as I'd known it would. The doorbell rang once, then again, harder. Then came the pounding fists shaking the wood. Dad opened the door. My son's voice was raw, furious. We're not finished. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, my hands steady. I opened the door just enough to face him, but not enough to invite him inside. He stood there with his wife at his shoulder, both of them looking like they hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, his jaw set like stone. His wife's glare cut sharp, but I saw the tremor in her fingers. You think you embarrassed me yesterday, he spat. You think you won because you read some stupid letter. I held his gaze. I didn't win anything. Your mother spoke her truth, and I honored it. He stepped forward, but the threshold stopped him. That house is mine. Mom wouldn't cut me out. You tricked everyone. You forged it, didn't you? I lifted the envelope just enough for him to see the seal. It was notarized. Legal. Ironclad. She made sure of that. His wife hissed, We could fight this in court. We will fight this in court. I shook my head slowly. Go ahead. But every lawyer in this county will see what Jessica wrote. And they'll see the truth. You can't hide your greed. His face darkened. He jabbed a finger at me. You can't keep me from what's mine. You think you're strong now with your neighbors clapping for you? That doesn't last. When it's just you in this house, when you're old and weak, who do you think will be left to take care of you? I leaned forward, my voice low, steady. Certainly not the son who showed up at his mother's coffin demanding a deed. Not the son who sent threats instead of love. I'll take my chances with silence before I rely on that. His nostrils flared. His wife tugged his arm, but he jerked away. Don't talk to me like I'm nothing, he shouted. You owe me. All those years you worked, it was for me. For this family. And you're just going to throw it away on a little girl who doesn't even know what it's worth? Emma's face flashed in my mind. Her bright eyes, her small hands curled around a sketchbook. My chest hardened like steel. She knows more than you ever did, I said. His face twisted, his fury breaking into something uglier. He lunged forward, his hand brushing the doorframe as if ready to push his way in. Don't I warn, my voice sharp as glass? For a heartbeat, he froze. My words, my tone, it was enough to remind him there were lines even he hadn't crossed yet. His wife grabbed his sleeve again, harder this time, pulling him back. Let's go, she hissed. We'll handle this another way. But he wasn't done. He pointed at me, his finger trembling with rage. This isn't over, old man. You think you can shut me out with a piece of paper? You'll regret this. Mark my words, you'll regret it. I straightened my shoulders, square, my hand tightening on the edge of the door. No, I said quietly. The only thing I regret is that I raised a son who sees love as property. What happens next, that's on you. For a moment we just stared at each other, father and son, mirror images distorted by years of sacrifice and greed. Then he turned sharply, stomping down the steps. His wife followed her heels, striking the wood like gunshots. The car engine roared to life. Tires spat gravel as they tore out of the driveway, leaving only silence behind. I stood in the doorway, the cool morning air brushing against my face, my pulse steady. My hand tightened around Jessica's envelope, its weight both anchor and shield. Inside, the clock ticked. Outside, the neighborhood stirred awake, dogs barking, children laughing, life continuing. And I knew as the dust settled on the empty driveway that this battle wasn't just about property. It was about legacy, about drawing the line my wife had asked me to hold. And I was ready. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't soothe me. It throbbed raw and unsettled like the air before a thunderstorm. My son's words still echoed against the walls. "You'll regret this." I sat at the dining table, Jessica's envelope laid carefully in front of me. My fingers brushed over the seal again and again, not out of doubt, but as if drawing strength from her steady hand even now. I had stood my ground at the church. I had refused to yield at the door. But if I truly meant to hold the line, it wasn't enough to resist him with words. I needed protection that would last beyond another argument or slammed door. So later that morning, I gathered the documents, the notarized deed, Jessica's letter, and the folder of estate papers we'd prepared years earlier. I slipped them into my worn leather briefcase, the same one I had carried to work through decades of overtime shifts. Today, it wasn't for work. It was for survival. The law office sat in a brick building downtown, its stone steps worn smooth by years of footsteps. I had been there before with Jessica by my side back when we first drafted our will. Her hand had been warm in mine that day, her laugh soft, as she teased me about being too serious. Today, the seat beside me in the waiting room was empty. The receptionist greeted me with quiet respect. "Mr. Carr, she'll see you now." Inside, Margaret Summers rose from behind her mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She had been our attorney for nearly 15 years, steady and discreet. If anyone could help me build a wall strong enough to withstand my son's fury, it was her. "Max," she said, gently motioning for me to sit. "I heard about Jessica. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I murmured, lowering myself into the chair. "But that's not the only reason I'm here." I opened the briefcase and laid the envelope on her desk. Margaret studied it, then looked at me, her brow furrowed. "What happened?" So I told her. About the funeral, the demand for the deed, the letter, the confrontation at my door just this morning. My voice was steady, though each word carried the weight of betrayal. She listened without interruption, her pen gliding across yellow legal paper as she took notes. When I finished, she leaned back, folding her hands. "Max, what you're describing isn't just family tension. It borders on harassment, threats. And the document your wife left, she tapped the deed with her pen. This changes everything. It's legally binding, and it gives you the power to protect Emma's inheritance in a way your son cannot touch." How my voice came out rough. "We create an educational trust," she explained. "The house remains in your name for the rest of your life. But upon your passing, ownership transfers directly to Emma, not her parents. The trust ensures it's used for her benefit, college books, tuition, even housing if she needs it for school. Her parents won't have access. Not 1 cent." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "And if he tries to fight," Margaret's eyes sharpened, "let him. The courts will see the notarized deed, your wife's letter, and the trust structure. He'll have no standing. In fact, if his behavior escalates, we can file for a restraining order. You'd have police protection if he shows up again." Her words steadied me like iron beams in a crumbling house. For the first time in years, I felt something close to control. Not reaction, not scrambling to clean up another crisis, but real, deliberate control. Margaret slid the trust papers toward me. "It will take a few signatures and a notary visit. After that, Emma's future is shielded. Your son can scream, threaten, pound on doors all he wants, but the law will stand between you." I looked down at the papers. Jessica's voice echoed in my head again. "Hold the line, Max." "I'll do it," I said. "Steady now." "I should have done this long ago." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "You're not punishing him, Max. You're protecting the innocent. That's what good fathers do." I signed where she pointed the pen, scratching across thick paper. Each signature felt like closing a door that had been left open for too long. By the time I placed the final period on the last page, the weight on my chest had shifted, not gone, but different. Heavier in some ways, but secure. Anchored. When I left the office, the clouds had broken slightly, sunlight glinting off the wet pavement. I walked slower than usual, breathing deep. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel like it was pressing me down. The fight with my son wasn't over. I knew he would come back angrier than before, convinced that shouting and threats could undo what had been sealed by law. But now I wasn't just standing in my doorway with shaking hands. I had a shield. And more importantly, I had fulfilled Jessica's last request. The trust wasn't just about money. It was about Emma, about tomorrow, about proving that love isn't measured by what you hand to the greedy, but by what you safeguard for the innocent. As I slid behind the wheel of my car, I whispered into the empty seat beside me. "We did it, Jess. She's safe now." The silence held steady. But in that silence, I could almost hear her sigh of relief. 2 days later, the phone rang just after sunrise. The sharp tone cut through the quiet house, bouncing off the walls like an alarm. I let it ring twice before lifting the receiver, already knowing whose voice I would hear. "Dad?" His voice was ragged, strained. "What have you done?" I said nothing at first. Silence has power. I let it stretch until he spoke again, louder this time. "I went to the county office. Don't play dumb with me, I saw it. The house. The deed. The trust. You gave it away." I rested my elbow on the table, staring at Jessica's photo propped by the window. Her smile steadied me. "I didn't give it away," I said calmly. "I protected it. For Emma." His breath hissed through the line. "Emma, she's a child. She doesn't know anything about deeds or trusts. That house belongs to me." To me, I closed my eyes, briefly feeling the years pressing on me. "No, it belongs to the future." And Jessica made sure of that. There was a long pause, then a crash in the background, maybe a fist against a wall, maybe something heavier. His wife's voice shrieked faintly in the distance, but I couldn't make out the words. He came back to the line, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you've beaten me with some paperwork? You think hiding behind lawyers makes you righteous? This is war, Dad. You're tearing this family apart." I gripped the receiver tighter, my voice steady. "No, son. Greed tore this family apart. All I did was draw the line." He laughed, then a harsh, bitter sound. "Fine. You want to cut me out. You want to make me the villain. Don't expect me to play nice anymore. You'll regret this. You'll die alone in that house, and when you do, there won't be anyone to bury you but strangers." The words stabbed, but they didn't break me. I'd heard too many threats to be swayed by another. If strangers bury me, then at least they'll do it with respect. More than I got from my own son at his mother's coffin. The line went dead. He'd hung up. I sat there for a long time, the silence humming in my ears. Outside, the world was beginning its day. The Henderson kids riding their bikes, Mrs. Patterson watering her roses, the mailman making his steady rounds. Life moved on steady, indifferent. But inside me, something had shifted. It was no longer about whether my son would come back shouting at my door. It was about preparing for what he might do when shouting no longer gave him power. By noon, I had my lawyer's card in my shirt pocket and copies of the trust locked in my desk drawer. Margaret had warned me people who feel entitled rarely accept boundaries gracefully. She was right. That afternoon, Daniel came by. He leaned on the porch, railing, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Heard your boy's been storming around town. Folks at the bar said he's spitting mad." I nodded. "I know. He called this morning." Daniel's eyes softened. "You okay?" I looked past him across the quiet street. "Okay enough. For the first time, I know I did what needed to be done. Doesn't make it easier, though." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes the hardest thing a father can do is stop saving his kid." The words sank deep, heavier than the coffee cup I cradled in my hand. Stop saving him. That was what I had done. That was what Jessica had asked me to do. As Daniel left, I sat on the porch, the late afternoon light slanting across the street. The air smelled of cut grass and charcoal smoke from someone's grill. It should have been an ordinary day, but the storm clouds gathered not in the sky, but in my chest. That night, the phone stayed silent. No apologies, no attempts at reconciliation, no manipulative pleas about Emma and Jake. Just silence. But I knew my son. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And as I turned off the lights and walked through the empty house, Jessica's voice echoed again in the stillness. "Hold the line, Max." "I'm holding it," I whispered into the dark. "Even if it breaks me." The silence held for 3 days. 3 days of waiting, of watching shadows stretch across the walls, of listening to the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. It was too quiet, too calculated. On the 4th night, the storm broke. It was just after midnight when I woke to the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. Headlights swept across my bedroom ceiling, flooding the walls with harsh white before disappearing. My heart thudded steady but alert. I sat up listening. A car door slammed. Then another. Voices low, sharp. My son's. His wife's. I reached for the lamp but stopped myself. Light would only paint me as a target. Instead, I slipped out of bed, pulling on the same dark jacket I'd worn to Jessica's funeral. My hands found the envelope on the nightstand, the copy of Jessica's letter I kept close now, like a talisman. Through the lace curtain, I saw them, my son and his wife, standing at the edge of the porch, their faces twisted in anger. He pounded on the door with his fist harder this time than he ever had before. The wood rattled. "Dad," he shouted, his voice carrying into the night. "Open up, we're not finished." "You hear me? We're not finished." I stood just inside the hallway, my hand on the doorknob, my breath steady. I could smell the faint tang of gasoline from the car still idling outside. The night air pushed through the gaps in the doorframe, cool and sharp against my skin. When I didn't answer, he pounded again harder. "You think you can cut me out. You think you can humiliate me in front of the whole town. I'll show you what happens when you cross me," his wife's voice cut in shrill and desperate. "Just get it. We'll get the papers, get the deed." I clenched my jaw. They still didn't understand. There was no deed left for them to take. It was already locked away in a trust beyond their reach. The pounding grew louder, faster. The doorframe groaned under the assault. And then came the sound that froze me, a shattering crash. Glass breaking. A rock hurled through the front window, spraying shards across the hardwood floor. The night wind rushed in with the smell of dust and honeysuckle, mingling with the sharp metallic tang of blood where a shard had cut my hand. That was it. The line had been crossed. I reached for the phone and dialed with steady fingers. 911? "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "This is Max Carr," I said, my voice calm. "My son is trying to break into my house. He's already broken a window. Send someone now." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Stay inside, sir. Officers are on their way. Do not engage." But I couldn't stay silent. Not this time. I stepped back toward the broken window, glass crunching under my slippers. My son's face appeared in the jagged frame, eyes wild, fists bleeding from the shards. He looked more like a stranger than my boy. "Dad!" He screamed. "Give me the papers now." I lifted Jessica's envelope, holding it up to the dim porch light so he could see. This is all that's left of what you're fighting for. And it's not yours. It was never yours." His wife gasped. "He's taunting us," she hissed. I shook my head slowly. "No. I'm telling you the truth. You can't face your mother saw who you'd become. She chose Emma. She chose tomorrow. And I'll die before I let you destroy that." His face twisted into something between rage and desperation. He shoved his hand further through the broken window, reaching for me, but I stepped back. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder. The color drained from his wife's face. "Will we have to go?" she urged. Now, but he stayed, his eyes locked on mine, his chest heaving. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You're gonna regret this, old man." The flashing blue lights cut across the night as squad cars pulled into the driveway. My son cursed, jerking back from the window, glass crunching under his boots as he fled to the car. Tires squealed, gravel sprayed, and then they were gone, swallowed by the dark. I stood there, bleeding, hand clutching Jessica's envelope, the cool night air rushing in through the shattered frame. When the officers stepped inside moments later, their flashlights sweeping across the wreckage, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. The storm had come to my doorstep, but I was still standing. The broken window was still taped over with cardboard the next morning when I sat at the dining table, Jessica's envelope beside my coffee cup. The cuts on my hands stung with every movement, but the sting reminded me of something important. The line had finally been crossed, and there was no going back. The officers who had responded the night before left me with a card. "Mr. Carr," one of them said firmly, "this isn't just family drama anymore. It's a criminal matter. File a restraining order. Don't wait." So I didn't. By 10 o'clock, I was back in Margaret Summers' office, the manila folder heavier than ever in my briefcase. She listened, without interruption, as I described the pounding fists, the shattered glass, the way my son had looked through that jagged window, as though he were willing to break the whole house down just to claw at what he thought was his. When I finished, she nodded, her expression grim but steady. "Max, this confirms what I told you before. He isn't going to accept boundaries peacefully. He's escalating. The restraining order isn't just a formality, it's a shield. Once it's granted, every attempt he makes to harass you becomes the police department's problem, not yours." Her assistant wheeled in a stack of forms. Margaret slid them across the desk. "We'll request an emergency protective order today. Given last night's incident, the judge will grant it without hesitation. After that, we'll petition for a permanent restraining order, no contact, no entry, no threats. He violates it once he goes to jail." I picked up the pen, my fingers rough and stiff. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't easy signing a document that would legally brand my own son as a threat. But then, I pictured the broken glass, the blood on his fists, the desperation in his eyes, and Emma's innocent smile. I signed. The scratch of my name across the paper felt like a door closing, not gently, but with finality. By the afternoon, I was sitting in the courthouse, the protective order already stamped and filed. The bailiff read it aloud, each word echoing like a hammer. "William Carr, Jr. is hereby restrained from any contact, physical or electronic, with the petitioner Max Carr. Any violation will be subject to arrest." I folded the document into my briefcase. For the first time in years, I felt not only protected but vindicated. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting on the porch. He took one look at the taped-up window and shook his head. "He really did it. He did." I lowered myself into the chair beside him, my hand throbbing under its bandage. "But it's over now. The order was filed today." Daniel nodded, his eyes steady. "Good. He needs to learn you're not his punching bag. You've carried him long enough." We sat there in silence for a while, watching the Henderson kids ride their bikes up and down the street. Their laughter drifted through the air light and unburdened. For a moment I let myself imagine Emma among them, free from the poison of her parents' greed. That night, as I prepared for bed, I set the restraining order beside Jessica's letter on the nightstand. 2 documents side by side. One written by love, one written by law. Together they built the wall I had needed all along. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. No pounding fists. No slamming doors. Just the quiet rhythm of a house finally protected. In the morning, Margaret called. "Max, the sheriff's office served the papers to your son and his wife this morning. They are officially barred from contact. If they show up again, don't open the door. Call the police. The law is on your side now." I thanked her, my voice rough. After hanging up, I walked to the mantel and placed Jessica's envelope beside our family photo, the one I had righted weeks ago. Her handwriting and her smile stood together, a reminder of what this fight was really for. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It was about drawing the line that love alone could not hold. The restraining order was more than ink and paper. It was a promise that my last years would not be spent as a hostage to greed, that Emma would inherit more than walls, and she would inherit proof that her grandparents had fought to protect what was right. I ran my thumb over Jessica's smiling face behind the glass. "It's done, Jess," I whispered. "He can't touch us now." He can't touch her. Outside, the morning sun spilled over the neighborhood, catching the fresh tape on the broken window, turning it golden. For the first time in years, I felt the peace of boundaries, ironclad, unshakable final. The house was quiet again, but no longer heavy with dread. The broken window had been replaced, the fresh glass gleaming under the afternoon sun. The smell of sawdust still lingered faintly in the air from the carpenter's visit that morning, mixing with the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I sat on the porch, Jessica's letter folded carefully in my pocket, the restraining order tucked away in my desk. Across the street, the Henderson kids laughed as they chased each other through the yard. Their joy floated over like music light and unburdened. For the first time in decades, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: peace. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the funeral, the demand at the altar, the betrayal written across my son's face, the storm of threats and broken glass. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made, every overtime shift, every dollar handed over in the desperate hope that it would build him a life better than mine. And then I thought about Emma. Her smile, her innocence, her small hands gripping a pencil as she drew pictures for us on the kitchen table. She was the future Jessica had written about, the future we had both fought for in our own ways. The trust was set. The house, the inheritance, the stability, everything was safe for her now. My son might rage, might spit his venom, but the law stood between us. And more than that, the truth stood between us. I leaned back in the rocking chair, the wood creaking under my weight. The late summer breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of church bells. My rough hands rested on the arms of the chair, hands that had carried this family for decades. For once, they didn't feel heavy. Inside, I heard the faint clatter of dishes. Jessica wasn't there, but I imagined her still moving about, humming the same tune she always did when she washed the cups. I closed my eyes, letting that phantom sound fill me. I whispered into the stillness. I held the line, Jess. And for the first time, I truly believe she heard me. The neighbors had been right. I wasn't alone. The witnesses who stood by me, the lawyer who shielded me, the community that applauded when I read Jessica's words, they had all carried me through when I thought I had nothing left. But in the end, the choice had been mine. To stop enabling. To stop bleeding for those who only took. To protect what mattered, not for myself, but for tomorrow. That was what fatherhood really meant. Not endless sacrifice until you were emptied, but the courage to draw a line so the next generation could walk safely forward. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the porch. I rose slowly, joints stiff but steady, and walked inside. On the mantel sat our family photo, straight and clean beside Jessica's envelope. Her handwriting glowed faintly in the fading light. I touched the glass gently. "We did it," I said. "She'll be all right." The quiet filled the house, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was a gentle silence, a healing one. The kind that comes when storms have passed and the air is fresh again. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the table looking out at the neighborhood. Children's voices, dogs barking, sprinklers ticking in someone's yard. It was ordinary life, and it had never felt more precious. I knew challenges would come. I knew my son's anger wouldn't vanish overnight, but I also knew the fight was over for me. The trust was set, the protections were in place, and my soul was lighter. I had reclaimed my role not just as a father, but as a man who had chosen dignity over fear, truth over silence, love over greed. And as the evening shadows stretched across the floor, I whispered the words that had carried me all this way: hold the line. Because sometimes holding the line is the only way to love. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and leave a comment with your thought. I wish you health, peace, and happiness with your own families. Until next time, take care.